For years, we were told that the right path was simple. Study, get a good job, work hard, save, avoid debt, and hope everything turns out well. Many followed that path with discipline, and yet they lived tired, frustrated, and afraid of the future. The question is uncomfortable, but necessary. What if that model was not designed to form free people, but dependent people? The Bible reveals an uncomfortable truth. God never formed His children in comfort. He formed them in the process. Abraham did not receive a map. He received a promise. Joseph did not receive stability. He received trials. Moses did not receive security. He received a desert. And Jesus Himself was led into the desert before beginning His ministry. God does not form character in the comfort zone. He forms character where there is no safety net. 1. The problem is not money. It is dependence. The central problem many people face is not the lack of money, but the emotional and mental dependence they develop toward it, especially when their only source is a salary. Biblically, money was never presented as the enemy, but it is a dangerous master when it takes the place that belongs only to God. Jesus was clear when He said that no one can serve two masters, because sooner or later one will end up ruling the heart. When a person depends exclusively on a fixed income to feel secure, their peace becomes tied to a fragile, changing system that is outside their control. Israel left Egypt physically, but their mindset remained enslaved for years because they associated security with human provision and not with God's faithfulness. That is why the desert was necessary not to destroy them, but to teach them that daily provision comes from God and not from structures that promise stability but cannot sustain the soul. 2. The Father who does not give you everything. One of the most difficult spiritual principles to accept is that God, as a Father, does not always give us everything we ask for, even when He has the power to do so. And this is not a lack of love, but wisdom. Throughout the Bible, we repeatedly see that God allows temporary lack, adjustment, and waiting as tools of formation, because an unprepared heart can destroy a blessing received too early. Just as a responsible father does not give a child everything in order to prevent dependence or immaturity, God often restricts in order to develop discernment, strength, and capacity. Abraham had to walk without a map, Joseph had to endure betrayal and prison, and Moses had to spend decades in the desert before leading. The absence of comfort does not mean abandonment, but training, and understanding this completely transforms the way we interpret the difficult processes of life. 3. The desert as God's school. In human logic, the desert represents failure, loss, and setback. But in God's logic, the desert is an intensive school where what truly exists in the heart is revealed. It is in moments where there is no steady income, recognition, or guarantees that genuine faith, obedience, and true identity come to light. The desert removes distractions and forces us to confront our deepest motivations, revealing whether we trust God or only what He can give us. Jesus Himself was led into the desert before beginning His public ministry, not to be weakened, but to overcome the temptation to use power without obedience. The real danger is not going through the desert, but avoiding it, because a life without process produces people without character, and character is what sustains the blessing when it finally arrives. 4. Slave mentality versus son mentality. Scripture clearly distinguishes between a slave mentality and a son mentality, and this difference deeply affects how a person relates to work, money, and purpose. The slave lives focused on survival, seeks immediate security, fears losing what little he has, and obeys out of necessity, while the son understands his identity, trusts in the provision of his father, and acts from relationship rather than fear. Many believers love God, yet continue to think like slaves, with a limited mindset that keeps them trapped in cycles of fear and dependence. That is why the renewal of the mind is a central principle of the gospel, because spiritual freedom is not only lived in the soul, but also in the way we think, decide, and act in response to the resources God places in our hands. 5. Working with purpose, and not just for money. The Bible never teaches that work is merely a means to earn money, but rather an expression of purpose, stewardship, and service. When a person works only for money, their emotional stability becomes tied to external factors, and fear becomes the primary driver of their decisions. When work is done with purpose, however, money stops being the goal and becomes a tool. The Apostle Paul taught that whatever we do should be done as unto the Lord, which elevates work to a spiritual dimension. God does not bless blind dependence on human systems, but responsibility, diligence, and the wisdom with which we manage what we receive. Working with purpose frees the heart from the slavery of money and allows provision to flow without becoming an idol. 6. Debt, wisdom, and biblical discernment. The Bible approaches debt with balance and discernment, making it clear that it can be either a tool or a chain, depending on how and why it is used. The problem is not the concept itself, but the lack of wisdom and purpose behind its use. Some debts are born from consumerism, pride, or social pressure, and these generate bondage. But there are also financial structures that, when used with knowledge, order, and vision, allow resources to multiply and impact to expand. Joseph, in Egypt, managed an entire economy with strategy, foresight, and planning. And he was not condemned for it, but exalted. The difference between slavery and dominion is not in the system, but in the mind that operates it and in obedience to God's principles. 7. God does not promise comfort. He promises presence. One of the most important truths a believer must accept is that God never promised a comfortable and predictable life, but He did promise to be present in every stage of the journey. The stability the world seeks is external and fragile, while the stability God offers is internal and firm. When everything around us is shaking, it is faith that sustains us, not circumstances. God does not form His children to depend on structures, but to develop deep trust in His faithfulness. God's presence in the midst of uncertainty is worth more than any human guarantee, because when He is the source, no crisis can dry up what He sustains. 8. Internal economy versus external economy. We all live under an external economy that constantly changes, with inflation, crises, opportunities, and losses. But few consciously work on their internal economy, which is where the most important decisions are made. Two people can face the same economic situation and experience completely different outcomes, not because of the context, but because of their mindset. Faith does not eliminate difficulties, but it transforms the way they are faced. A person with a weak internal economy interprets every problem as a threat, while someone with a renewed mindset sees opportunities for growth even in the midst of chaos. The Bible teaches that self-control and wisdom begin within, and from there they are projected outward. 9. The true entrepreneur of the kingdom. From a biblical perspective, an entrepreneur is not simply someone who starts businesses, but someone who faithfully multiplies what has been entrusted to them and does not bury their talents out of fear. Jesus praised the servant who multiplied and confronted the one who hid, making it clear that the kingdom advances through responsible faith, not passivity. Many call themselves entrepreneurs, but in reality they only trade time for money and carry the greatest fiscal and emotional pressure because they have not developed a mindset of dominion and stewardship. The true entrepreneur of the kingdom understands that their responsibility is to create, manage, and expand, always under principles of integrity, service, and purpose, knowing that God honors faithfulness, not fear. 10. When everything falls apart, God is still God. There are moments in life when everything seems to collapse at once: income, plans, security, and expectations, and it is precisely there that who we truly trusted in is revealed. God does not allow these moments to destroy us, but to redefine our foundations and rebuild us from a more mature faith. When external structures fail, God's presence becomes more evident, and what seemed like loss becomes an opportunity for alignment. Every fall, when lived through faith, strengthens, purifies, and prepares us for greater levels of responsibility and blessing. Character is formed under pressure, not in comfort. Conclusion. God does not call us to live as slaves to human systems, but free within them, with a renewed mind and a heart aligned with His will. He does not call us to love money, but to manage it wisely, understanding that it is a tool and not an identity. He does not call us to depend on a paycheck, but to depend on Him as our primary source. The desert is not punishment, it is preparation, and the Father who sometimes adjusts and limits is the same, one who knows exactly who we are becoming. When God is our source, no system can dry us up, no crisis can define us, and no process is in vain. Many times, God allows our securities to be broken in order to reveal where our trust truly was. When what once sustained us stops working, we discover whether our faith was placed in a system, in an income, or in Him. It is at that point that faith stops being theory and becomes daily practice, where we learn to walk not by sight, but by trust. There we understand that true provision does not begin in a bank account, but in a heart aligned with God's purpose. If this message helped you see finances and faith from a deeper, biblical perspective, subscribe to the Biblical Finances channel to continue learning how to apply the principles of God's kingdom to your financial, mental, and spiritual life.